Okay, everyone, so the last thing that we're going to look at this week is we are going to look at annotations. And so annotations, tooltips, these things are implemented in not dissimilar ways, but one of the things that is often in many visualization libraries that is difficult to implement, but really, really important. And again, I strongly urge you all to look at print graphics in newspapers, even if you just pick up and peruse a copy at the newsstand without buying it, or of course check out something in the library. Is that having sort of on chart annotations, right? Little notes that highlight important events, things like that, is really, really valuable for articulating highlighting the salient points about data. So keeping in mind that again with our headlines, we always want to have those active headlines. And so if we're talking about if our headline references a certain segment of the data, we want to be able to highlight that. And we talked about how, especially when we consider, the fact that most of our users are going to be seeing our work principally on mobile. You don't want to depend on heavy interaction. You don't want to depend on interaction to get the initial point across. So having things directly labeled that are visible in the data area, right, and not just in surrounding text is really, really important. So in Google Visualizations, this is served through something called the annotation. So there's a whole segment here about quote-unquote roles, and you can see that there's a bunch of things that are available to us here. Annotation text, certainty, emphasis, interval, scope, style, and tooltip. The ones that you're going to sort of see the most of are going to be annotation text, and tooltip. Things like interval are going to be less applicable for us most of the time. But what you see is, so this sales example is showing a bunch of different things at the same time. So it's showing certainty, which is this A, B, C range. That's interval. Certainty is actually the dashed line as opposed to the solid line, which is actually a very useful option in some cases. And again, if we look back at the Amanda Cox example of the porcupine graph, porcupine graphic, right, which I think is a really, really nice example of sort of visual storytelling. And of course, you all saw her presentation this week. We can see how she makes great use of these things, right? So it's visualized a little, it's represented slightly differently, but we see that there's certainty versus uncertainty here. We see, of course, a nice reference line that there's annotations in the text. And again, these are our annotations, right? This 2011 proposal, this 2010 estimate, things that are visible immediately upon coming to the graphic. And so we do have this rollover capacity, but importantly, we can see significant data points highlighted for us at the time that we arrive. So how do we actually implement these? It's fairly straightforward. Basically what we do is we add another column of data. And in the way that we have ours set up, this isn't too difficult because we're actually already, in our for loop, we're already constructing what in our case is initially a 2-item array. And we're going to just make that a 3-item array, and the third item is going to be the annotation. And so the way that I like to do this is because you're never going to want to highlight more than 1 or 2 data points, and you may have many, many, many data points. The thing that you want to look at is this is where you're going to use a conditional. So you're always going to have to have the same number of itams in each row, right? So you're always going to have 3 items if you have for example, a date and data, and then your third column is going to be where your annotation goes. All of your rows have to have 3 columns. It's just that the ones that don't have annotations, the annotation column will have the empty string, right? It'll have sort of 2 pairs of quotes. So what I'm going to say is this is where I'm going to use a conditional. So we've talked about how conditionals are mostly used in corner cases. So I'm just going to pick a date kind of out of the air where I say, if, this great big honking thing that I'm sure you all have created a local variable for. If this is, and I'm going to pick a string, I'm going to say, okay, if this is, let's say if this is, 1993 0101, right? So I'm going to say, look, if it's this exact date, then I want you to add, oops, wrong file. All right, so if it's this exact date, then what I want you to do is onto item array. I want you to push, right, my annotation, otherwise, else, push the empty string, right? So the end result, the net effect here is that every single item, right, every single mini array in our larger array ends up with 3 items. It's just, it ends up with some text as the annotation if it happens to be this one date, and it ends up with a blank otherwise, right, which means we won't see anything. Now, of course, now that we've done this, we also need to make sure that we adjust our data table and that our data table knows that that third column of stuff, right, is meant to be our annotation. And if we try to run it as it is, it's going to complain at us, I'm pretty certain, because it's going to say, look, you've given me 3 columns of data for a 2-column chart. So here we see uncaught error row given with size different than 2, the number of columns in the table, right? So this is the part where we create our table and we say add column, and then add rows, and they're saying, look, you gave me rows that have 3 things in them, but you've only told me about 2 columns. So again, here I'm going to say add column, and in this case is where I'm going to go back to my documentation and say, okay, how exactly do I do this? And the answer here in our example is I'm going to say, okay, data.addColumn type string role annotation. And I can even take the comment here. Okay, so I'm actually just going to go ahead and do that. And now, hopefully what we should see is an annotation show up on our chart for 1993, actually both of our charts, right? Because we're using the same function for both of them. And there we go. So we see this overlaid annotation on the chart for the 1993 or 90 database, right, or data point. So this also highlights, you know, what some of the potential issues might be in positioning those annotations. It's not necessarily, I mean, we can futz around with this in terms of the look and feel. And I think actually it is pointing to this specific bar, but because we still have that trend line left in there, it's a little bit difficult, and of course all these messy grid lines and things like that. So obviously there is, this is pretty much the non-ideal chart and page layout, but just to start to give you a sense of how to do these things. Yeah, that's really about it. You know, we have a lot of different ways that we can manipulate these things. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we use this library, because it lets us control things like interaction, annotation, tooltips, all of that to a pretty fine degree. So this is what we'd like to see you use for your assignment for Friday, is kind of looking at these and making sure that you're really highlighting the salient data points, you're cleaning up and customizing all of your axes and labels and legends and all of that to really jive with everything that we've covered in terms of the sort of base guidelines from this semester so far. So if you have any questions, please feel free to post them to Lore sooner rather than later. Obviously everyone's going away for holiday, and many of you I know will be well occupied working on your master's projects, so the deadline is Friday to allow for that. Yeah, look forward to see you guys in a couple of days.